Parents of Reddit. What is the creepiest thing your young child has ever said to you? I was talking in my 2-year-old. He said, "Goodbye, Dad." I said, "No, we say good night." He said, "I know, but this time it's goodbye." Had to check on him a few times to make sure he was still there.
While changing my daughter in front of the open closet door, she kept looking around me and laughing. I asked her what was so funny. She said, "The man." To which I replied, "What man?" She then pointed at the closet and said, "The man with the snake neck." I turned around and nothing was there. I'm afraid to look into the history of my house to see if anyone hung themselves in the closet. At least she wasn't scared.
My 3-year-old daughter stood next to her newborn brother and looked at him for a while, then turned and looked at me and said, "Daddy, it's a monster. We should bury it."
I was on a bus recently, and we were stopped outside a walk-in clinic. A little girl in the seat in front of me turned to her dad and said, "Death is the poor man's doctor," and that was that.
I jokingly asked, "What's the best way to get a girlfriend?" 7-year-old's response, "Tell her to be my girlfriend or she'll never see her parents again."
I asked her, "Why are you crying?" She replied, "Bad man." I replied, "What bad man?" She goes there and proceeds to point behind me at a dark corner of the room. Lamp on bookshelf next to said darkened corner falls off as soon as I turned to look. She slept in our bed that night.
My 5-year-old son asked me last week, "What do you see through the black circles in my eyes when you're controlling me when I'm at school?"
So I shouldn't throw him in the fire? 3-year-old daughter holding her baby brother for the first time.
I was sound asleep, and at around 6 a.m. I was woken up by my 4-year-old daughter's face inches from mine. She looked right into my eyes and whispered, "I want to peel all your skin off." The backstory here is I had been sunburned the previous week and was starting to peel. It was pretty terrifying for a few seconds. I didn't know if I was dreaming or what was going on.
I don't have kids, but once, visiting some friends on a farm, my buddy's youngest girl, 5 or 6 at the time, was afraid of the chickens. I tried to explain to her that the chickens weren't there to hurt us, but she wasn't having it. So I'm sitting around the fire pit, looking at one of the chickens a few feet in front of me when I felt a hot breath in my ear. And she proceeds to whisper, "See, he's always watching." Horrific and hysterical all at once.
I work in a preschool. Creepy stuff gets said and done all the time. The one that sticks out to me happened last year. There is a small kitchenette area in our classroom that the kids use during free time for playing house or whatever pretend games they think of. There was one little girl that I was keeping a close eye on, mostly because of how withdrawn from the other kids she was. I noticed she was playing with a baby doll in the kitchenette, rocking it back and forth and singing to it. She then took the baby, shoved it into the play oven and slammed the door shut. She turned around, looked straight at me, and said, "Sometimes bad babies go in timeout," in the creepiest little girl voice I've ever heard before. Smiling and running off, that one kind of shook me.
When I was a little girl, I lost my mind when I saw some guy at the grocery store. It was unusual because I was generally quiet and well-behaved. I never had to be taken out of somewhere for misbehaving, but we had to leave the store. When we got in the car, my mom asked what was wrong. I told her he took me away from my first mom and hid me under his floor and made me sleep for a long time until I woke up with my new mom. I then refused to sit in the seat of the car on the ride home, but insisted on carrying under the dashboard so he couldn't take me again. It freaked her out, as she is definitely my biological mother, so obviously my first mom.
My noticeably pregnant sister and I were having a conversation at the dining room table. My 4-year-old son was also present and asked my sister there was a baby in her belly. She affirmed he, completely straight-faced, slid from his chair and headed for the kitchen saying, "We need to get it out."
My 5-year-old adopted little sister has a game she would play where we would pretend to go round to people's houses and take their children. Once we rounded up enough, we would eat them. Violently and maliciously, this was her idea, through and through. The name of the game? Social worker.
My 3-year-old nephew was at my cottage. He's asked me numerous times about the girl over there while pointing at one of the back bedrooms. The place is small, and there is definitely nobody there, so I just dismiss it as a really active imagination, noting that he has lots of imaginary friends. Then some friends are visiting, and they have a daughter around the same age. She has never met my nephew. Twice in the one day she asked about the pretty girl while pointing at the exact same room. Definitely caught me out, and I didn't know what to think. Then at Christmas my family was over at my place, and my nephew points at a picture of my wife and asks if she is coming to visit us here. Or does she just stay at the cottage? My wife died 10 years ago. Personally, I don't really believe in paranormal stuff, so it's probably just my logical brain putting together a bunch of kids' ramblings. But it definitely got my attention.
My 5-year-old at the time had night terrors and would scream in her sleep. One night I said, "Mama's here, it's okay." She looked right at me, still asleep, and screamed, "Mama." But who is that behind you?
Trigger warning. When I was around 6 years old, my dad's best friend ended his life. We'll call him Joe for the sake of the story, obviously. It was a very rough and emotional time for my dad. Joe was my dad's best man at his wedding, the one guy who was always there for him. After my dad got married, he and my mother left Joe and the town they were in to start a life outside of the town they grew up in after years of moving around California. My family eventually moved to Utah, where my father worked for a successful internet business. Joe stayed behind in Washington because my family were so far away from their old life with Joe. There wasn't a lot of warning that Joe intended on ending his own life. Joe's sister apparently had been blaming Joe's wife for it. Joe and his wife drank a lot of booze and probably as a result, fought a lot. My father always said that they were a passionate couple. Yes, they would fight often, but he hardly knew to other individuals who were so completely in love. For this reason, he didn't believe it. A few days after Joe ended his life, his widow called up my father sobbing about how she thought it was her fault. After about an hour of trying to console her, he told her if there was a way for me to talk to Joe now, I guarantee you that he would tell you that he loved you, and that it wasn't your fault that he ended his life, crying. She still didn't believe him, but she thanked him for the kind words and let my father go. My dad was obviously distraught. After that long, hysteric conversation, he had been down in his office for a while, and he decided to come up and check on his kids. While making a pot of coffee to take his mind off of things, we were all supposed to be napping, but he thought he'd peek his head into our rooms. To make sure we were safe, maybe try to have a little smile or brightness added to his day. Sure enough, when my dad got to my room, I was fast asleep on my bed. He went to my brother's room, and he was also sleeping. Finally, he checks on my sister, who is sleeping as smugly as an angel. He decides to go back towards my room and into the kitchen to make some coffee. As he walks by my room, he notices a whimper. He turns around and enters my room, where he finds me weeping. I was 5 years old, so the way I was crying seemed odd to him. Normally, a 5-year-old would cry drastically over dramatically. I wasn't. I was just sitting on the side of my bed, weeping. My dad enters my room and says, "Maddie, what's up? Why are you crying?" It's then that I stop crying for a moment. Look up at him with teary eyes and say, "Rick, it's not her fault. I love her. It's not her fault." With that, I stopped crying, rolled over back onto my bed, and fell swiftly back to sleep. Needless to say, my dad shit his pants.
Hope you enjoyed the stories. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell and leave a comment.